But even if you set your boundaries, that doesn't mean that people will respect them. I used to have a PI who would sit outside my office and wait for me to go over grants long before I was ready, right? It was a bit of a trek for them to make it to my office, actually. So it's not like it was close by. But they reasoned that if they just showed up at my office, that I would have to see them if they were sitting there when I came in. Now, my processes allowed investigators ample opportunity to book time with me, so it wasn't like I was unavailable. I was available at various hours throughout the day. They had their financial reports regularly. The only reason this PI did this was because it happened to be the day that they decided to look at their financials. And they had a lot of questions that had to be answered this instant. They were one of many investigators that I supported, and I never knew when they would show up, right? So, and at the time, I would typically use my first hour to kind of orient myself to the day, and I didn't schedule meetings during that time if I could avoid it. Though there were some that typically had to be at that time, which is fine. Again, spongy days. Now, for a while, I let this derail my day, and I let the PI in, and I honestly didn't know how to turn them away when they were standing right in front of me. Like, it's just, they would be there, and I'd be like, okay, fine. Eventually, I started to get annoyed, and I realized that it wasn't even solving anything. And in fact, it was really harming our relationship. Like, I wanted to help the PI. The PI wanted me to help them. There was no reason for us to have a difficult relationship, but that's what was happening. I needed a plan, and I didn't have one. And so I started creating plans for redirection. So if they'd be outside my office, I'm sorry I can't meet with you now. Let's get something on the schedule for later. I have to get on a call and redirect them. But it was a journey, right? For a long time, I just sucked it up and slowly redirected them. But eventually I figured out that if I'd say, okay, let's set a call. I'm getting on a call right now. And I just start doing the thing after we'd schedule a time, right? Eventually they got it. We had the time on the schedule and it worked out fine. But it took time for us to be able to workshop that out. And frankly, they were able to get time on that day often. So like, it's not that they were not getting what they needed. They just had to learn a little bit of impulse control, right? Like we all do. I have lots of trouble. In order for us to figure out how to set these boundaries and how to work through them in a healthy way with both ourselves and other people so that we're using it as an opportunity to strengthen relationships and not accidentally damaging relationships, let's talk about breaking down the mechanics of this experience that we just talked about and like how that works. Okay. So there are many people for whom we need to set boundaries. Okay. And when we do, there is a tension. For example, you have investigators who ignore deadlines and then maybe constantly cause you to work late because they ignore deadlines. Managers who have unrealistic expectations of your time or your productivity level or what you should be doing. There's a lot of different areas where you're going to find that you need to set boundaries, especially if you had poor boundary hygiene like I did. Now, one of the major issues is that we expect people to simply respect them because we say this is a boundary. A lot of times people don't recognize boundaries for what they are because they're so surprised to see them. They're just like, oh, haha, and they will keep going, right? Oh, haha, you're clocking out at 6. No, really? Can you do this now? Right? And so they won't respect them. Not because that person is a bad person. This is really important. People who push up against boundaries are not bad people. But people forget, they don't realize, sometimes they're not thinking, and we can be thoughtless. I am guilty of this. The challenge is, I set a boundary. I tell a PI that I'm not available after 6 p.m. to work. The PI emails me, then he texts me, then they call me after 6 p.m. By the time they call me, I answer the phone, annoyed because the PI isn't respecting my boundaries. So now I'm going to be angry, I'm frustrated, I'm upset. I'm less likely to stick to that boundary, and he's less likely to respect it. And then when he calls again, I'll pick up and then continue to be upset. And now I'm just upset with this PI all the time. It is my job to maintain that boundary, and I need to create a moat around myself. I'm sorry, this is my boundary. Let me dig a moat for myself to erect around myself. Okay. So the way that you've got to do it is first, you will need to know what your boundary is around a certain thing. So for example, I clock out at 5. Okay. You need to have something to redirect them to so that they have momentum. Because if I come to you saying I need a thing, I have momentum, right? And if I say no, I'm being met with a brick wall and it's like I run into the wall, thud, that doesn't feel great. Okay. And it's jarring. If instead you say, okay, this is great. I can help you with this. Let us do it have your redirection in there, right? So for me, I would say, okay, I understand that you need help with this. Let's touch base about this tomorrow morning when I get in at X time. Shut my computer, right? So I've redirected them and we'll meet tomorrow. Okay. You got to have that script in advance so that you know where you're going to redirect them to. And then last but not least, you've got to be uncomfortable and remaining silent after setting your boundary and simply reiterating the same thing over and over. So And I have done this with this particular thing where basically it's like, I'll talk to you tomorrow. Now, for the most part, nobody even cares. They're like, great, I'll see you tomorrow. And what I thought was a requirement of me actually just turned out to be someone sending me something because they were working on it at that moment and now it's with me, right? And so they were fine with it. Sometimes people are like, I really needed to talk to you then. And now I'm uncomfortable, right? That's the moment where I say, I'm here now, let's talk, right? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that discomfort because I'm here now. We don't need to spend a lot of time talking on it. I've actually been asked, I would like you to stay later. And then I say, unless something is an absolute emergency, right? Which in our business, we know what those emergencies are. I can deal with it the next day. Okay. That person's going to be uncomfortable in that moment, right? But after a little while, what happens then is people start reinforcing it for you. So I was in a meeting a few months later and somebody said something about, okay, I'll send this to Minessa after this. And the person who actually was the one who really wanted me to be late said, oh, and it was really, they didn't say it with any attitude or anything. They said, can we do this tomorrow morning? I know Minessa clocks off at 5, right? And it wasn't said, sometimes people say it with like well, Minessa clocks off at 5. That wasn't what it was at all. It was like, great, this is fabulous. I don't need this till tomorrow. I know you clock off at 5. Let's take care of it then, right? And honestly, it wasn't a thing. And what ended up happening was other people started seeing me do that. And though essentially there was some resentment initially, more and more people start to clock out because they see that no one dies. There's no explosion. The world doesn't end when someone clocks out at 5 and they're empowered and emboldened to do it themselves. Now, the thing is, though, with this idea where you set the script and you use it, is that it assumes in advance that you know what you're going to get return pressure on and what it assumes that everybody follows the script that you tell them to, like life. Sometimes it's difficult to think on the fly, right? So I don't think well on the fly at all. If you surprise me, I am not going to be able to set my boundary very well in that moment if it's something I wasn't expecting. So if you catch me without my being prepared, I typically bend my boundary. I used to typically bend my boundary and simply do the thing, but I'll always be ready next time. Now, what I typically say is, I'm autistic. I need a few minutes to process this. Can I get back to you? Because it's true. I am autistic. I need a few minutes to process this. I will get back to you. And that gives me the time that I need to sort of just figure it out in my brain. Now, so once you decide that there's something that's bothering you and a boundary will solve the problem, you first have to be very clear what the issue is and what is the behavior that you actually want, right? So decide what you want and what you do not want to do so you know what your boundaries are. This builds over time, right? So you may not know what your boundaries are right now around certain things. I realized I was feeling icky after a certain time during the day. So after 2:00, I typically, because I have fibromyalgia, I typically get a little bit foggy after 2. So I don't typically do meetings after 2. But I'm able to do a lot of flow work. So I get a lot of really good flow work done then, but talking is not easy for me. It's the connection between my brain to my mouth that creates a problem around that. So I typically don't take meetings after that. I learned that over time. I haven't known that about myself forever. I've actually only very recently learned that in the last, say, 2 years or so. And so I figured out what boundary would help. And I worked that. Now I don't typically do things after 2. In terms of meetings, I don't typically take meetings after 2. If I do, I usually will allow myself the morning to do something a little bit easy so that I don't feel a little bit taxed by the middle of the day. Wherever possible, pre-publish your guidelines. Okay, so if you decide you're like my clocking, because I'm using clocking out as the example, but let's say our work hours are 9 to 4. I know a lot of people who actually put those in the signature of their email just so that the expectations are pre-published, they're set, people know when they can expect to hear from someone. Have a script ready. You can download the Boundaries Done For You scripts, and then you redirect people. And then lastly, for a lot of us, being available, working all the time, it has a lot of deep roots. Okay. So this idea and the philosophies that we have about boundary setting are much deeper than a short video is going to be able to solve. Like, I can give you tactics, I can give you ideas, we can talk about it, but the way that we actually feel in the moment when we set a boundary and that someone pressures against it, or we set a boundary and they don't even, right? Like, I've set boundaries where people are like, okay, and I feel guilty about it, even though nothing bad happened, but I feel guilty because I didn't do the thing. And literally, I've actually chased after them and like, no, I'll do the thing now, right? Like, because we all have a lot of stories that are deeply ingrained. And so I would recommend reading the book Laziness Does Not Exist by Devin Price. It was a very powerful lesson for me in terms of where a lot of these beliefs come from, and it gave me the opportunity to kind of decondition some of that from within myself. So in addition to now having the tactics, I also have massaged it within so that I don't actually have the guilt. I don't actually have the worry. I'm able to perform at a high level. Like, my stories are very different. The stories that I tell about work are very different.